We're calling this Deep Dive History. This is as deep as you can possibly go on a given topic, given that we are moderately educated and amateur historians, right?
Right. Deep as you could possibly go. I don't know. Within reason, right?
Within reason. Well, for us, that could be 10 minutes, or it could be 2 hours. I don't think we're actually sure.
Well, let's try.
So, Operation Unthinkable. I think this one was my idea to start off with.
Well, we kicked around the idea about what should we talk about and what are things that people may not know about. And you threw that term out to me, and I'd never heard it before. And I think of myself as a moderately educated person in 20th century history. Well, when I asked other people that I knew who I consider to be well-read in history, especially about things that have to do with World War II, they never heard of it either. How did you come across it?
You know, I think maybe this applies to only people interested in history or just any topic. Wikipedia is awesome. So one day I was just looking through Wikipedia, World War II related material, and you can get lost in the rabbit hole very easily on Wikipedia. Whatever I was looking at, I came to something called Operation Unthinkable towards the end of the war section. I was like, ooh, what's this? I've never heard of this. It's got a cool sounding name. And so Operation Unthinkable is Winston Churchill's plan to surprise attack the Soviet Union at the very end of World War II. And as we're going to get into, the very next day after he projects it's going to end, because he's so worried about what Stalin is going to do in Western Europe. So that's the crux of it.
And it begs the question, why isn't it more well known? If World War III, when I think about World War III almost beginning, having been a product of the mid-1900s, I think about all those times that we were scared that World War III was actually started because of some computer glitch, or some guy looked at his computer screen and a flock of geese went over and they looked like a flight of Russian bombers, or the movie Computer Games. And there was always going to be some computer glitch or something that was going to accidentally start a war. But why don't more of us know about the fact that things were actually being planned even before the fighting was done in World War II? It's got a great name. It's perhaps the most...
It's got a great name. It would make a great movie, now that I think about it, now that you mentioned that. It's the first instance of this potential World War III plan. I think it's important to preface at the start that Operation Unthinkable is actually two separate plans. The one that we're going to talk about and that people kind of know more about is the offensive plan, which is the British forces, the American forces are going to attack the Soviet Union in Central Europe. There's actually a second plan, which is more holding the defensive line in Europe, that becomes kind of the secondary plan. We're going to talk more about the first one. So I think what makes sense for us to begin with are the two main characters of the story. And this is Churchill, of course, and Stalin. And we're going to kind of assume on this podcast that you know a little bit about them. And there's always this question of where do we start when we're talking about history, because you can start at any given point. So we're going to make some references to some things that have happened in their past and maybe World War II, but we're not going to go into literally every single detail.
Right, because if you go into too much background, we'll be going back to the World War I or even before that. And we don't want to necessarily do that, but we do want to go. You came up with the title Deep Dive, and we want to go maybe deeper. And assuming people have a pretty good understanding of what happened, we want to sort of peel back that layer of the onion there and see if we can inform people about something that they might not otherwise have heard about.
And so Churchill's looking at post-war Europe. What's it going to look like? He's extremely worried about the Soviet Union. Why do you think Churchill thinks this plan is so necessary? We kind of read a few different sources. You just read the huge biography on Churchill. I think Andrew Roberts is the author.
Yes, Churchill, Walking with Destiny,
okay.
Viking Press, 2018. I actually was listening to the book. It's about 50 hours long, and
wow.
I made it through about half of it, but then I went and got a hard copy and started leafing through the back of the book to see if Unthinkable was mentioned. And this book covers every aspect of Churchill's life. from his youth all the way up through the end. It's incredibly well researched. It's meticulous in its research, and it's very thorough in its depth and breadth. As far as Unthinkable goes, Roberts takes the impetus off of Churchill and puts it on the joint planning staff of the War Cabinet.
Right. Important to note, they're the ones that actually designed the plan. Churchill just kind of ordered it, right?
Right. Well, they bring it to him and say, I mean, they're looking at the fact of the matter with all of these Russian divisions in Central Europe right now, and I should say Soviet divisions, right? And they're looking at the simple math, and they know that the Americans have an unconditional surrender outlook toward what's going to happen in this war. And now that we've defeated the Germans, or we're on the cusp of defeating Germany, a lot of those American divisions are going to vanish and have to go to the Pacific. And if that's the case, the joint planning staff of the War Cabinet comes to Churchill and says, those Americans leave, we're going to be incredibly outnumbered. What if the Russians roll to the Atlantic? What are we going to do?
Right.
And so Churchill says to them, okay, come up with a plan. And so it is at Churchill's behest, but I think it's because this joint planning staff does their job, looks at the numbers and says, we could be in real trouble here.
To what extent is Churchill an anti-communist? Because I've heard differing positions on that, where this is most of his motivation for this plan. But then you have instances during the war where he's very laudatory of Stalin. They seem to have a good relationship. They met in November 1944, interestingly, without FDR, and they kind of drew their own post-war map of Europe, and they agreed on various spheres of influence. And Churchill was in a great mood after that meeting. And there are some instances of maybe Stalin not following through on everything, but then all of a sudden to turn around and maybe suggest we should invade the Soviet Union or invade Central Europe, Soviet-controlled territory. How much of this is based on his long history of not really trusting communism or being afraid of it or thinking that the world should eradicate it?
It's hard to say because Roberts goes into great depth about his early political career, and there are times where some of the programs that he's talking about, I mean, he feels that if government's going to be there, my reading of what Roberts had to say is that, yes, government should help people. It should not be, he loves the empire. We know that he's an imperialist. We know that he is not necessarily a socialist, but at the same time, I think he's troubled by the disparity that he sees in British society. And he's vehemently anti-communist earlier in his career. And then when Hitler shows up, so all of a sudden, he's warning everyone about this fascist threat to the status quo of Europe. No one's listening to him.
This is his claim to fame. He knew before everyone else.
That's it. He saw it coming. And he famously says, I'm going to paraphrase the quote, right? I'd make a deal with the devil if I had to. If he came out,
right.
If the devil came out against Hitler, I'd sign an alliance with hell, something along those lines. And I think as the war goes on, and now he sees that the Soviets are not going to agree with the deals that they've made at Yalta, with the deals that they've made at Tehran, that he now is, to his horror, faced with a new totalitarian power on the continent. And what have we done? Have we replaced one totalitarian leader with one who's now even stronger, who is a bigger threat than possibly we had before?
Even though it's looking ahead a bit, he's also well known for this Iron Curtain speech, right, that he gives in the United States in March 1946. And this is after Operation Unthinkable, the plan is proposed, and ultimately they decide not to go with it. But there's a few quotes from it that I think are worth looking into that really suggest what he thinks is at stake here with the Soviet Union. He makes reference to Christian civilization being at huge risk here. Let me read you a couple important lines from the Iron Curtain speech. He says, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sevilla. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and all are subject in one form or another not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in some cases increasingly measure of control from Moscow." I find this interesting because I don't think any of that really objected to what was agreed to at Tehran or Yalta, right? It was kind of understood that the Soviet sphere of influence was going to include those places.
Well, I think the first sign, the first things that really upset him, when it looks like the Soviets are not going to keep up with the agreements that were made over Poland. And of course, this is why the British declared war against Nazi Germany, was the invasion of Poland, September 1st, 1939. So the fact that now Poland looks like it's at the very least going to be partitioned, or that the Soviets are going to put their puppet government in place and they're going to exclude the Lublin Poles who are in exile in London from having anything to do with the government, which is exactly what happened. Well, we went to war with Nazi Germany to protect Poland independence, and now it's going to be frittered away. So if we went to war against Hitler and we defeated him, how do we not have a free Poland? I think that you had mentioned at certain points that he's looking back at this now, and he's concerned that he's going to end up looking like Chamberlain, who goes down in history as the milksop who caved and
the great appeaser.
The great appeaser
could have stopped Hitler.
Could have stopped him if he only had the guts. And there was Churchill who had the guts. Well, now I think you and I talked about different sources where it seems to be that historians are concerned that Churchill is terrified that he's going to be seen as another Chamberlain, because he's going to, if he doesn't stand up to Stalin and over Poland again, just as they stood up to Hitler.
This is where I kind of want to get into a broader kind of topic that I think can be helpful to explain both the behavior and beliefs of Churchill and Stalin. It's something called rational choice theory, and you can really apply it at any level to interactions and behavior that common people like you and I have, or in this case, political leaders. So the crux of it for the lay person is that you have a decision to make in your life, and you look at the different choices that are out there. You have choice A, you have choice B. You look at all possible outcomes, you consider all possible variables, you rank the choices that are available to you, and then the rational person picks the best choice out of that, based on whatever your methodology of calculation would be. So for example, do I eat this ice cream or do I not eat this ice cream, right? This is probably something that most people
I'm always
think
going to
about
eat the ice cream,
right?
John. I'm always going to eat the ice cream.
Right, but the argument for rational choice theory would be that you went through this process in your head where you said, this ice cream is going to taste so good, I'm going to enjoy it, it's going to be absolutely fantastic. And yeah, I might feel sick to my stomach after, I might feel bad about myself, I might feel guilty, but that does not outweigh how great I'm going to feel in the moment. Versus choice B, I don't eat it, I'm going to wish that I did eat it, and I'm not going to have that great feeling. And so that's choice 2 out of the 2 possible choices.
Okay, so help me understand how that would apply to Churchill or Stalin in this case.
Right, so we're talking May 1945, war's coming to an end. So if we look at Churchill's behavior, let's say he has those 2 choices. I can hope that Stalin is not going to roll through Western Europe. I'm going to trust him. Or I'm going to propose this Operation Unthinkable and I'm going to attack. And so he has to weigh those 2 choices. And I think given the context of everything that Churchill's been through, he doesn't want to be the next Chamberlain, as you said. I think he's very concerned about his place in the world. This is one thing we didn't get to, and maybe we will a little bit later when we talk about the big 3. I think he views himself as the third wheel. So this is one mechanism by which he could reinforce that special relationship with the United States. With someone like a Truman, you get rid of the Soviet Union in terms of the power that they're growing, right?
You still need us.
Right.
You still, we're gonna help you against the bad guys, and we didn't realize, but the new bad guy is now the Soviet Union, because I think at the end of Tehran, he's very upset the way that Churchill and Roosevelt seems like they're buddying up with each other. This must look like appeasement all over to him again. That now, I think he's upset that FDR seems to be cozying up to the Soviet Union in some ways, that they're going to let the Soviet Union have these satellite states in the East. This is appeasement all over again in one sense, and he believes, I think, Roberts talks about how his take, I believe, is that Churchill thinks that the Americans are playing Stalin, but they're getting played. And of course, the Americans think they can deal with Stalin better than Churchill can, and there's this competition between the 2. But I do think that you're exactly right, that Churchill sees his country, which was one of the leading powers on the planet, especially in the 19th century.
It's
in the
going
20th
away
century,
unless
it's
he
going
does
away.
something right now.
Right.
And so I think his interest lies not only in the future of Great Britain and the British Empire, but I think all politicians are ultimately guilty of this as well. They want to keep power for themselves. And Churchill's tenure is coming to an end, right? He's going to lose the prime ministership, I believe, in June or July.
But he doesn't know that.
He doesn't know that, but he knows that he's viewed as kind of the wartime leader, and now the war is coming to an end. And I know we were talking about this. He kind of loves war. It's kind of his fix. He gets pleasure out of planning and organizing and being in that situation. I'm not saying he's hoping for constant death and destruction, but I believe he feels that's his calling in life.
Well,
and now it might be over for good.
Well, I think there's something to that. We use the term addiction a lot in our society, right? People,
Yes.
like, I'm addicted to ice cream, right? To use your analogy from before, there's all kinds of times that we talk about people being addicted to a certain show that they might be watching. Well, it seems that Churchill might be addicted to war. His Brooke, his basically the guy that spends more time in the war with him than anyone else, is saying things that I think he seems to want another war. One of the books that I picked up and ended up tearing through, because I just went looking through books on Winston Churchill, I picked up Lynn Olson's Citizens of London from Random House. Fantastic book, not just about FDR and Churchill and these Americans, Edward R. Murrow, Winant, the American ambassador, and Harriman, and how these three guys were keeping Churchill and Roosevelt in communication with each other, but also a very strong social history about how the people of England went through the war and how they were experiencing the war. And she's got excellent testimony from people on all sides. One of the quotes from Olson that I found, this is on page 363, I feel very lonely without a war. I think he does see his place in history as this protector of Western civilization in a way. I protected it against Hitler. Now I can see another threat to this, and I'm screaming about it again. And once again, nobody seems to be listening. So it's got to be a nightmare that it's happening all over again for him.
Right. So you combine those two ideas together. I've come up with a valid reason in Churchill's mind why this war needs to happen. Stalin is a serious threat. And it allows me to go back to my calling and fight this war that's going to be ultimately necessary to preserve Britain and the British Empire.
Well, not just the British Empire. I think the
Western civilization.
Western civilization
Yeah.
in the way that this is the speech that he gives on VE Day. I'm on Olson on page 361. On the continent of Europe, we have yet to make sure that the simple and honorable purposes for which we entered the war are not brushed aside, and that the words freedom, democracy, and liberation are not distorted from their true meaning. Now, I don't think that is simply rhetoric on his part. I think he honestly is terrified that if the Soviets roll all the way to the Atlantic, what's to stop them from getting to England, just as they were worried that the Nazis were going to do? I don't think that it's only, hey, I see my role diminishing, either as prime minister or as England's role diminishing. I think there's a genuine concern that we actually did make a deal with the devil to defeat one evil dictator, and all we've done now is create a new power on the continent, and there's a new evil dictator that is twice as powerful as we ever could have dreamed Hitler becoming.
I do want to go back to what's going to happen post-war, Churchill's singular focus on that. But I do want to cover rational choice theory for Stalin. But just from the conversation we had, it's very clear that we could see how this could be the rational choice for Churchill. Even in a 2019 context, it's very easy to look at Unthinkable and say, the plan's crazy. Like, who came up with this idea? End of World War II, you're going to suddenly start at World War III?
I don't know. I'd have to say he certainly may not even want it, but necessity may bring this about, that it might have to happen. Whether or not he wants it, we can't let the Soviets roll completely to the Atlantic and possibly take us. So this is a defensive act.
So let's talk about Stalin's intent now. So
Sure.
This is all based on the idea that Churchill believes that Stalin could very likely do this. I think a lot of the evidence suggests that there's no good reason for Stalin to do this whatsoever. Obviously, that's easier to see, or easier to say, I should say, in hindsight. But if you look at the rational choice theory for Stalin, if his options are roll through Western Europe, or attempt to, or not, just stay put, let's look at the fact that through World War II, he's acquired this huge sphere of influence that he didn't have at all before. So in one sense, he's already made a huge gain. So there's no reason to risk that, and he's definitely going to put that at risk if he does try to make this bold move that Churchill thinks he's going to make. That coupled with Poland, and Poland is kind of the center of this story, and he has control over Poland. That was the big item that he wanted on the table. Now at Yalta, they kind of agree vaguely. I think a lot of the historians would say that Poland's going to have a democratic government. It's going to have elements of multiple sides in it, so it's fair to both sides. But it's kind of unclear how that's going to work out. But for Stalin, who saw World War I, obviously saw World War II, where invasions came through Poland, he's kind of in control of Poland at this moment, and there's not much I don't think the Allies can do about it. So why put that at risk? He doesn't need to go really any further than that. So if you just look at the rational choice theory, I feel that this is Stalin's best course of action. There's no reason to jeopardize going all the way to the end of the Atlantic. And if he did that, you would have to think that America would not stop until he was taken care of.
Well, it begs the question, doesn't it, that if the Joint Planning Staff of the War Cabinet for the United Kingdom takes a look at the map and says, hey, we could have a problem here, that there's got to be some guys in the Kremlin, in their war room and their map room, that are doing the numbers as well, saying, hey, what if? Or I think that there's obviously, we've talked about, you and I have just had conversations about the fact that when Truman walks up to Stalin at Potsdam and tries to inform him about the nuclear weapons that we have, and that we have this weapon of incredible immense power, and we're planning on using that, and Stalin basically looks at him and says, okay, because many historians have taken this, that Stalin knows exactly about the American nuclear weapons. He knew about them well before Truman told him, due to the spy network.
Sure.
And there's one source that I read where General Zhukov in Poland, at some point around the time where Operation Unthinkable is being worked out,
he tells them to get on alert.
Well, they start moving around in a certain way, and he starts redistributing the units all
as if
over
they know
Poland,
something might be coming.
as if they know something might be coming. So, and we haven't even gotten to the nuts and bolts yet about how many divisions there are, and would this thing even be possible? So I'm wondering if anybody brings that up to Stalin in the first place. They've agreed to attack the Japanese forces in Eastern Asia.
Right.
They're as soon as Hitler and the Nazis are defeated, we're going to start shipping soldiers across the continent, and we'll attack the Japanese in the first part of the war. That doesn't necessarily mean he's going to abide by that agreement. He's agreed to do that. They do. He does send the troops across. They do start fighting the Japanese very late in the war, which ends after the nuclear bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But I don't know if it's in his best interest to do this. As you said, I don't know if his army is victorious, but they certainly have to be taxed. It's just an enormous army compared to the Allied forces that are there.
Right.
There's
no doubt about that.
It would seem that there might be some general who's sitting in the room saying, hey, comrade, if we wanted, it had to have come up on the other side. We just don't have the documentation of that, right? I'm wondering if in some file somewhere, in some KGB archive, there's some Russian version of Unthinkable. Or the fact that, are they getting ready when their spies think that, hey, the British have this Operation Unthinkable plan on the table?
Well, it's interesting that you just said that, because I read a book called Great Wars and Great Leaders by Ralph RAICO, and it's comprised of a number of different essays, and there's one in particular about Churchill, and there's another about Truman as well. But he looks at this idea of, was there some type of Russian unthinkable plan on the table where Stalin really had this aggressive plan to take over Western Europe? And of course, when the Soviet archives open, all this wealth of material is out there for historians to analyze. And one historian in particular that RAICO quotes said the following: despite the fact that the Russian archives have yielded ample evidence of Soviet egregious behavior in many other spheres, nothing has turned up to support the idea that the Soviet leadership at any time actually planned to start World War III and send the, quote, Russian hordes westward. So you think if there was something, some historian would have picked on some nibble of evidence that suggested, yes, he was looking at this at some point.
Absolutely.
And there's just nothing.
But
maybe they burned it, or
that's just it. The lack of evidence, right? What would a conspiracy theorist say? The lack of evidence only proves the depth of the cover-up.
Right. Now, we're not saying you never thought about it. A rational person would think about it.
That's right. Yeah. And we know that, and part of the problem with rational thinker theory. I'm sorry, say it again.
Rational choice or rational actor theory.
Okay, rational actor theory is that frequently that can get you in trouble, can it? We saw many times in World War II where people thought, well, Hitler's not going to do this or Hitler's not going to do that. And he did not always act rationally. It's not necessarily rational for him to divert troops from the Eastern Front and send them over into the Ardennes for what we end up calling the Battle of the Bulge.
Sure.
Which, despite every intention that some people saw it coming, right? Patton screaming that if they're going to attack, it's going to be here. And he claims later to have known, or some historians said that Patton could foresee this attack coming. It wasn't in Hitler's rational best interest, but we're not talking about a rational person. If you try to think...
well, you're also applying the theory from an outsider's perspective.
True.
It may have been rational in his head.
Of course.
He miscalculated.
Well,
right?
That's my point.
He believed in Barbarossa, for example, that he could pull that off, and the variables and all the information to him said he could.
That's right.
But he was wrong.
You're stating my point better than I am, that to think rationally
doesn't always
when
mean
you're dealing with an
become
irrational person, it doesn't mean that you're going to be able to predict the outcome.
Right, especially when you're willing to ignore the advice of people who might know more than you, or at least have valid opinions that you're not going to take into consideration, which you're going to have when you have totalitarian leaders.
That's right. But I think that Churchill, if anything, would absolutely say that I'm just being rational. Roberts supports this, again, with that Walking with Destiny. I mean, it's funny because we read different books about this, but we're tending to find the same things.
Yes.
So from Roberts, page 879, quote, "The Operation Unthinkable documents do not imply that Churchill was an inveterate anti-communist warmonger, but show that he was preparing for every eventuality, however unlikely or unwelcome. They also underline how important it was for the West that the atomic bomb actually work," end quote. So Roberts clearly thinks that Churchill's acting completely rationally, preparing for every eventuality, as he said, and he knows that the United States are developing nuclear weapons. Does that factor into his thinking?
I think we definitely have to talk about nuclear weapons, but just the final point on that, I think Roberts is saying there that if we put ourselves in Churchill's shoes at that moment in time, most people probably would have made the same decision to come up with this plan.
I think it's so aptly named. It is unthinkable.
Right.
And let's be very
Barbarossa all over again, but worse, and maybe with nuclear weapons.
Perhaps. As terrifying as that could be.
I just want to go through one more thing that I got out of the RAICO book, Great Wars and Great Leaders. And so we talked about how the Roberts book that you read is very laudatory of Churchill. RAICO is very much the opposite. He's very critical. But I think a few of the things that he writes about there, well, I don't agree with everything he says. I think point to why maybe Churchill is someone who could singularly come up with the idea of Operation Unthinkable and why the plan is even necessary in the first place. So he kind of makes this point that Churchill is too singularly focused on defeating Germany and Hitler during the war, to the point where he's disregarding the very obvious long-term ramifications of what's going to happen in Central Europe as a result of defeating Hitler and eradicating Germany. In other words, there's going to be this big power vacuum that develops, and, well, who's going to fill that gap? Obviously, your ally from the other side, Stalin. And so if you really didn't like that person in the first place, well, you have to have known that this was going to happen. Now, the question is, did he have any other choice but to kind of go down that path to begin with? But I want to give you a few things here from RAICO to kind of make this point.
Well, I think it's easy for him to say that a little bit in hindsight being 2020. Right, we're looking at the end when we know the end of the outcome, you could argue. So it depends on when you're going to look at that question. Because if you're looking at it in 1941 and the Nazis are taking hundreds of miles a month into the Soviet Union, they're taking hundreds of thousands of prisoners, and it looks like they're going to roll all the way to the Urals, then if they do become the dominant power on the continent and they eliminate the Soviet Union, and now you're dealing with a Nazi state that has continental Europe as its home base for all intents and purposes, what does that future look like? And so
it's a fair question.
So I don't know if it's easy to say that to Churchill, well, I don't know if you should have made such a deal with the Soviet Union. You could have seen what they were going to do. You could have seen that they would have defeated the Nazi Germany and then wanted to buffer satellite states in between there. Well, I think that's looking back with 2020 vision.
We mentioned earlier about Churchill wanting to defend Western civilization. And I think he looks at situations like this with a little bit too much of a racial undertone, if you will. So you mentioned 1941. Perhaps it's too early to see exactly what's going to happen then. But 1944, when most historians would say the war's in hand, it's only a matter of time before Germany goes, there does appear that there was an opportunity for Churchill to help out the elements in Germany who were trying to overthrow Hitler. So Stauffenberg is a name people know. Operation Valkyrie, if you've seen the Tom Cruise movie out there. There was an opportunity for outside assistance to really help with that. And then you potentially have an end to the war in 1944. And I'm not sure where Stalin's forces are at this point, but they're not in Germany yet. And yes, Germany is not eradicated, and you have a very different Germany, right? Are we going to call Stauffenberg and all the people that were supporting him Nazis in the same way we're going to call Hitler that? Yes, they're Germans. Can they be trusted more than someone like Hitler can? Again, maybe you can say in hindsight, well, you can't really say. You can't really say for sure. But let me give you a little something here from RAICO. This is page 86, quote, "Instead of making every effort to encourage and assist an anti-Nazi coup in Germany, Churchill responded to the feelers sent out by the German resistance with cold silence. A recent historian has written, quote, by his intransigence and refusal to countenance talks with dissident Germans, Churchill threw away an opportunity to end the war in July 1944.
Let me just play devil's advocate with
Go
Mr. RAICO, and he's not here to defend himself, so it's kind of unfair for me to do this. But at the same time, so you're asking Winston Churchill to say to his people, after all of the years of speeches that we shall fight them on the beaches, we shall never surrender. And now you're asking him to ask the British people who've lived through the Blitz, who've had innocent women and children bombed. We've had London devastated. We've had all of the things that the British have been through, the incredible privations that they've been through, the nervousness about whether or not the Americans are going to come through the war. There's tremendous, one thing that Olson writes about time and time again in her book is how hungry the British people are, the rationing that's taken place. I found this in Olson on 366. Quote, a returning British soldier expressed shock at the conditions he found in London. This is at the end of the war when the fighting is basically over. In 45, he said, quote, it's hard to realize that I am in the capital of a victorious nation. There is no thought of triumph. The chief thought of Londoners is food. To say that Churchill at this point, when it seems like the war is going to go really well for them, and it looks like the end is near, and we can also now, there are people reaching out and they want to eliminate Hitler. I don't think it's in Churchill's DNA in any way, nor would I.
Oh, I agree. It's not in his DNA.
It's not in his DNA, but I don't think that's the possible choice that he could ever make after having told the English people that we're going to see this thing through. Hitler tried to destroy us. We're on the verge of defeating this guy, and now we're going to.
But he's going to be defeated anyway and potentially assassinated by rogue elements within Germany. And I understand that politically doesn't look as good because, A, you're not the one who really pulled it off, or you only have an indirect role in it. And, of course, there's the fear of you're leaving Germany still in a semblance of itself with people who might still have some Nazi connections. That's very dangerous.
Well, so you're going to have, on the map of Europe, you're going to have a Germany.
How many hundreds of thousands of lives are you going to save by ending the... How many people died between July 1944 and May 8th VE Day?
Granted. And that's...
Again,
it's a
in
horrific
hindsight,
thing.
you're right.
In hindsight, he should have made the deal when he had a chance in order to save lives. How many more people might have died because then we're going to get into all the what ifs and
yep.
to, as Dan Carlin always says, going off into the weeds here, and we could be talking. We're already talking about this thing for. It's probably already been a half hour.
I think it's going longer than we thought it was going to go.
Of course,
we haven't even gotten to the plan yet.
We haven't even, of course. But
it's a deep dive.
Well, we're learning, right?
Are learning.
It's our first time.
Yes.
We'll probably get better at this if anybody listens. I'm sure
right,
we'll
we might find out that we're done.
That's right. Hey, we took a shot.
We did.
Morally and ethically, to leave for Churchill, to say that Churchill could have left on the map, a map that would have a swastika on it, right? There's a Nazi state in Europe.
Would it have been?
I don't think it just staggers the imagination. I don't think the British people would have tolerated it.
Sometimes as a leader, you have to make some unpopular decisions, though, right?
Well, I think he made the correct choice when he said, I don't care. You eliminate Hitler. How's there a guarantee that we're going to get somebody who's going to sue for peace? Not to mention the fact Hitler might be one of your best allies in terms of defeating the Nazis because he does make irrational choices. Well, he invades the Soviet Union.
Oh, I see what you're saying, yes.
Right? I mean,
yes.
this is
He's his own worst enemy.
Of course.
Right.
This is one of the greatest things that helps England survive.
Right.
He turns and invades the Soviet Union.
Right. Whenever you look at mistakes made in World War II, it's always you invaded the Soviet Union. That was the stupidest thing you ever could have possibly
Don't
done.
get in a land war in Asia. If we learn nothing from The Princess Bride, then we know that. Now, again, I'm looking back with hindsight.
Of course.
But, of course, it seems completely irrational to invade the Soviet Union, even though in 1941 there were people terrified that it looks like he might do exactly
Look how
what
he
he said he was going
steamrolled
to
through
do.
France, though. I mean, yes, France is not
True.
Russia, but most people thought that France was a stronger power than Russia, I think, at that time.
Hindsight being 2020, you look back and you have to see, what the hell were you thinking?
Well, it kind of relates to this other point that RAICO goes into about unconditional surrender becomes the way by which you win wars. There can be no negotiated ends to wars anymore, especially when you're dealing with someone like a Hitler. I think that's what Churchill's thinking about. America adopts the same type of policy with Japan. We don't want to leave that country standing in any particular sense, even though I can't help but look back and think about all the people that could have been saved potentially as a result. But this also kind of connects to the last point I want to make about RAICO and some things that he says, and then we can get into the plan, finally, however far along we're in right now. I think Churchill, and this is the point that RAICO makes, more than most leaders at the time, and I say more than most because I think a lot of leaders are in this mindset back then and even now, is that he's willing to disregard the human cost of what it takes to win. And I think that if you look back at his history in World War I and some decisions that he makes in World War II, there's some controversial stuff in there. And RAICO goes as far as to call some of them war crimes. I don't know if I'd go that far because in the context of things...
On Churchill's behalf?
Yes. I know today in 2019 it's very easy to label like anything a war crime, 50 years ago, 100 years ago.
You got to give me some specifics where Churchill's a war criminal. And what was your phrase that you said?
Controversial decision.
Ignoring the human cost?
Yes.
For example?
So let's go back to World War I because this is where Churchill makes his name. This is where he gets his,
Gallipoli, right.
I wasn't going to go into Gallipoli, and this is one thing that I didn't know too much about before I read it in RAICO, is the big reason why Germany was defeated in World War I was this hunger blockade that's imposed on the German people. And that's the specific part of it, is that it's on the civilian population. So up until that point, we always have rules of war, what's ethical, what's not ethical. Up until that point, you don't really target the civilian population in quite that way. Obviously, you can make a good argument for we don't want food in the hands of the enemy soldiers, right? But it's so clear that this blockade is intended to starve the German people so they lose their will to actually fight.
Absolutely. World War I is total war. We understand that it's gone over that edge, right? Because now we have Zeppelins bombing British factories. The Germans are sinking ships, and the Lusitania goes down. Civilians are being killed. What's even worse, though, about the blockade, in the sense that I think it is at 1916, that's the turnip winter, where the Germans are completely suffering with
right.
Not just the soldiers.
Exacerbates the situation.
Absolutely. There's a terrible harvest, and you get bitterly cold winters where the German people are queuing up for hours and hours and hours just to get a handful of potatoes. They're literally in danger of starving. If there's something that could maybe get into the area of war crime, then I could see where you would say that when the fighting ends in November of 1918, the blockade isn't lifted until the Germans sign the Treaty of Versailles. In fact...
Which is how many months later? Is it a full year later? Yeah.
June of 1919? Well, June 28th, right? They signed it the symbolic day of the same day, 5 years since the assassination. So that's how many months more of people starving or not getting enough nutrition because they're basically being held hostage. So I would agree with you in that sense. I agree that, but that's not necessarily throwing his own people into the meat grinder. That's doing that to the enemy, where you've got Stalin, who is completely, he seems to be completely cold-hearted about the number of casualties that he's willing to take.
But that's the larger point that RAICO makes. For however much Churchill is willing to defend the British people and the British Empire, if it's putting other people at risk, he's generally okay with it, or if it means sacrificing other countries' peoples, including civilians, like in that situation. We know that in Operation Unthinkable, anyone can look at that plan and know there's going to be huge casualties, huge carnage. And yes, British people are going to do some of the fighting, but the bulk of it's going to be Americans and the bulk of it's going to be Soviets. And a lot of civilians are going to die. Just the last point on this hunger blockade, and then I have some examples from World War II that, again, RAICO very controversially, in my opinion, calls them war crimes. I think it's just in the context of the times. This is what a lot of leaders have done. But he says, quote, on page 66, the hunger blockade of World War I had some rather unpleasant consequences. About 750,000 German civilians succumbed to hunger and diseases caused by malnutrition. The effect on those who survived was perhaps just as frightful in its own way. A historian of the blockade concluded, quote, the victimized youth of World War I were to become the most radical adherents of National Socialism. They were to become your Nazis.
Frequently, we in America...
It's the same as we look at the Treaty of Versailles as this is what caused Germans this hatred of everyone, all the allies in World War I, and
right.
Similar to the hunger blockade, right? My family starved to death in front of my eyes as a 10-year-old boy. How do I not become a Nazi after that?
I had this conversation with somebody else once, and they wondered, how is it that Nazis could fly over London? How could these German soldiers in the Luftwaffe, how could they drop bombs on innocent men, women, and children in London? And the point that I made was because I think there were many people in America who know a lot about World War I and World War II who don't necessarily know that the blockade continued from Armistice Day all the way through to the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. Basically, another, I don't have a calendar, but it's about 6 months, right? Another half a year of people starving. And then how many people died before they were supposed to, right? Maybe not directly starved, but, elderly people or people who got sick. We know the Spanish flu devastated Germany. So how many people, you just threw a stat out a minute ago, how many people died as a direct result of that?
750,000.
The point that I made to somebody about bombing London was, I'll bet those pilots who are flying over are thinking exactly about that blockade that happened at the end of World War I. I'll bet those pilots are maybe even thinking of as they were young men growing up. If they're born around that time, if they're in their 20s, right, then they're flying over London. I think they're thinking about the time that, hey, my dad told me about his mother succumbing to starvation, to being starved and being malnourished at the very least, right? Let's not maybe say that they're starved, but the malnourishment that took place, people dying ahead of their time, or as a direct result of a British policy. I think it makes it a lot easier to drop bombs on London. And I don't think Americans are as familiar, for the most part, with the blockade, and that it continued after the fighting ended in November and carried on until June.
I didn't know anything about it until I had read about it in RAICO. So I think Churchill, if he were here, would say, once you start worrying about people dying, then you put yourselves at risk of not winning the war and coming up with the actual objective, right? People are going to die in war, including civilians, I think he would say, and you have to be singularly focused. But again, as I said earlier, I think he should have seen that power vacuum coming. A couple things from World War II, and again, we can debate these. There's the incident of the French ships in the Mediterranean where he orders the bombing of, are you familiar with this one? 1,500 French soldiers were killed. Basically, the French said, we'll scuttle our ships because the Nazis are taking over France at this point. The French say, we'll scuttle our ships if it comes to it, but don't sink us right now. In my opinion, Churchill jumps the gun and just starts shooting at the ships, and 1,500 people die on his orders. So, questionable move.
It's a Vichy ships, right? It's a Vichy government?
No, this was the actual French government.
I understand, but at the time, I know that I'll counter that with the fact that, when the Americans land for Operation Torch in North Africa, they're under fire from French soldiers. Right? Those French soldiers didn't seem to have a problem killing Americans and fighting against the Allies in North Africa.
We could also talk about potential terror bombing in Germany at the end of the war. Incidents like Dresden have been blown up, past the actual numbers. But nonetheless, there's a quote, I think, from Bomber Harris, who basically says, there are no more targets in Germany anymore. Basically, every civilian center in Germany has been leveled to the ground. And you wonder to what extent that's actually something that's going to help win the war. I think there's some evidence that it just fulfills Hitler's idea of we're going to fight to the end. Because look at us, they're eradicating us. They're bombing civilians. Like, why wouldn't we just fight to the end?
Sure. And I think a stronger case can be made for the possibility of Dresden as a war crime because it served no tactical or strategic purpose in destroying that city.
Right.
Having said that, I don't think that this means that with Operation Unthinkable that Churchill is so addicted
making
to
a long
war.
way around here.
Right. I don't think
Unthinkable.
that the fact that those things took place would put Churchill in the mood of saying, look, I'm so addicted to war that I want war for war's sake, and I don't care how many other civilians have to die as long as I'm still the prime minister and I'm still calling the shots in a war. I think he does love conflict, and in the sense that I think he loves the struggle, overcoming whatever it may take, overcoming the people who are trying to take over his island. And now he sees the potential threat again. I don't think Churchill's a megalomaniac that has to be in power and is looking for a conflict.
I don't want to say that that's what I actually think. I just think it's important to put out this counter narrative that you don't hear too often. I think, Churchill's kind of viewed as this man of the century, and he defended Western civilization, as you say, and he was right about Hitler when no one else was. And that's kind of his legacy. And I think in the context of Operation Unthinkable, if he's familiar at all with Operation Barbarossa and he knows about the Eastern Front of World War II, and we've talked about this before, 90% of all casualties in World War II were on the Eastern Front, and this is going to be just like that. How could it not be? And from everything we've talked about, it seems like a rational move to come up with this plan and propose it. But then you go with, do we want Operation Barbarossa again, but with Allied soldiers and Allied civilians?
Well, it depends on what the outcome is, right? Before we go into the nuts and bolts of what actually might have happened,
Sure.
Would this thing even have worked? Did it have a snowball's chance in hell of even being able to be pulled off? And some people think yes, and I don't know how I feel about it. I'm usually come down on the no side, and I'm very glad that it didn't happen. However, if the end game is to move into the Soviet Union and conquer it and make sure it doesn't exist anymore, then that's insane. Mm-hmm. However, if you're trying to get the Soviets to adhere to agreements that were already agreed upon at Yalta or Tehran, then that's a different story. Or if you're trying to restore the pre-World War II borders, now that's a different story.
Sure.
Are you trying to just make sure that Poland is a free and democratic society? That's a different story. If you have a limited strategic objective, right, and all wars are political. Politicians are the people that declare wars. Wars need to have clear-cut political aims if they're going to be successful, in my opinion. Then that's a different story about what the end goal would be. Are we trying to take territory from the Soviet Union, or are we trying to just let them know that we're not going to stand for them, not adhering to their agreements, and or perhaps even prevent them from rolling all the way to the Atlantic?
And I think the reality of the situation is that to secure a lot of those political aims, there is a human cost with that, and perhaps it's worth it. One more critique of Churchill. I know I'm going seemingly crazy here, but I think it gets us to Yalta, and then we can actually get into the plan. Part of what was agreed to at Yalta involved the repatriation of 2 million Soviet citizens who had fled during World War II, fled west. Many of them who had fought against the Soviets, and Stalin wanted them back, understandably, from his position. And Churchill, I think, maybe rationally thinking, well, there's no way we can really resettle these people or feed them even, and, so be it, they're Soviet citizens. Why wouldn't Stalin want them back? He sends them back as part of the deal. And when that happens, well, you can imagine what happens to those 2 million. Most of them end up in the gulags, most of them die. Stalin's paranoid, of course, about, anyone having a contrary opinion. So do you put that all on Churchill? I don't know if I would. I think it's a really, really unfortunate situation. But again, wrapping it all back up, he's grown up in this society and in this world where human costs are so large that he's willing to brave them once again for Unthinkable.
Sure, and I don't know if you could put that all on Churchill's lap. Many of the agreements that he's signing off on.
If you want Stalin to play ball, you kind of have to
throw
him a few bones, right?
Right, and there are times where the United States has said that, we're going to play ball with the Soviets here, and we're aware of the fact, and many of the diplomats who are, the generals who are in these positions at these conferences are aware of the incredible human sacrifice that the Russian people have made in this war. So I don't know if you can lay that all on in Churchill's lap. I think these alliances are complicated things, and there are some concessions that they're having to be made.
Well, I think the Americans have a big role in this too. FDR obviously at Yalta in the last couple months of his life. What they want more than anything is help with Japan. So that comes first, and I think they're willing, along with Churchill, because I think Churchill at this point has no choice but to kind of follow FDR's lead on this one. They want Soviet help on Japan, and they're willing to give up anything in order to get that. And of course, Stalin does agree 2 to 3 months after Germany is defeated, we'll help you over with Japan. And we definitely want to talk about that in the context of the plan, because there's this kind of element of it that I know you and I both disagree with, the idea that if unthinkable happens, Japan and the Soviet Union are going to form an alliance. But I think it might be finally time to get to the plan.
So that's part one, John, and we're going to get to part two. We're editing, and we're going to talk about the actual plan itself, what the British thought they must have to do in order to drive the Soviets back.
That's it. I'm John, he's Deron. For Deep Dive History, we'll see you next time.